Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week we're looking at what happens next in Ukraine, suddenly a very live question in the wake of the inauguration of President Donald Trump. Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine, but fierce fighting continues. This week I'm joined by Mark Landler, London bureau chief of the New York Times, who was also White House correspondent during Trump's first presidency. We've also got Francis Dearnley from the Telegraph, who hosts their award-winning podcast, Ukraine the Latest. And from Chatham House, Orysia Lutsevych, who is head of our Ukraine Forum and deputy director of our Russia and Eurasia Programme. Welcome to you all.
Thank you very much.
Nice to be here.
Good to be back.
Let's start with the current state of the war in Ukraine then. And Francis, may we start with you? Does either side hold the upper hand now?
It's still very much a grinding war. I think the most extraordinary thing is that if you ask most people when they think the bloodiest phase of the war was, they would say in the first month or two. The bloodiest month of the war so far was in November. And so the meat assault attacks that Russia is conducting is devastating from the perspective of their own forces. But of course they have more of them.
This is the meat grinder, that horrible phrase of just throwing people, including North Koreans?
Indeed. Well, we've
this.
had apparently 1 in 10 of the North Koreans that were deployed, about 10,000, are already out of action by their own sort of meat assaults. Yes,
I'm recoiling a bit from that phrase, but of the meat assaults. But just on this at this point, just over the last few months, is Ukraine doing a bit better? I'm not fishing for optimism, but just fishing for the reports we've had, it seems to be regaining.
There is no breakthrough from the Russian perspective. And in that regard, that is good news for Ukraine. I mean, as you say, considering where we were, there were fears that within weeks around Christmas that the Kursk incursion would have completely removed from Russia that the Ukrainians did back in August, and that there would be some kind of breakthrough in the Donbass. That has not happened. And that is critical for Ukraine, and this idea that as it enters a negotiation phase, it appears strong, so that the talks that will start will not be from the perspective of Russia has the momentum here.
This is exactly the point I was hoping we'd get to as we go on to talk about the deal, which we'll do right now. Mark, Trump, thrown into this picture, said more about ending the war very, very quickly. What should we make of it?
Well, classic Trump braggadocio, and it's clear even a week into the new administration that the president and the people around him recognize he's not going to fix this in a week, probably not in a month, probably not in 6 months. Now, it depends on which advisor you listen to figure out what time frame they now think is realistic. But the retired general Keith Kellogg, who Trump has put in charge of the effort to negotiate or see through some kind of a negotiated settlement, seems to be thinking months, if not longer. And so I think we can now assume that the idea of a lightning fast resolution is off the table. I mean, I think what you saw with Trump last week with this long post that he sent out to Vladimir Putin was kind of all the classic hallmarks of Trump, the deal maker in action. As you alluded to earlier, this kind of sotto voce, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, the threat of sanctions, of tariffs, of using kind of
tightening sanctions and tariffs on Russia and on countries dealing with Russia. And
right.
There are quite a lot of them still.
There are. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the pressure on Russia itself, it shows that the degree to which Trump is wedded to this idea that economic pressure can be brought to bear in almost any kind of bilateral situation. And in this case, there's quite a lot of skepticism about that because, for one thing, the U.S. doesn't have that much bilateral trade with Russia. So the idea of putting tariffs on Russia is of limited value. And we already have had very heavy sanctions on Russia for quite some time, and it has yet to change Putin's commitment to the war. So in terms of the policy prescriptions that Trump, or the tools that Trump put on the table last week, I think the Russians might have looked at them and yawned a little bit. But the Russians are clearly going to take Trump seriously and attempt to use Trump to their advantage. And I think you saw that in Putin's reply, which was not contemptuous. It was, in fact, a reply where he sort of flattered the president and said, well, if you'd been president, maybe we would be in a different place. So at the moment, Trump, like like other leaders, or rather Putin, like other leaders, is playing up to Trump a little bit. And so we'll just have to see how the dynamic between the two of them develop, and then importantly, what role either of them have in mind for the Ukrainians, which at the moment seems to be, let's cut a deal over their heads.
We'll come on to that in a moment. I just want to ask you about one extraordinary moment. I'm drawing here a bit more on Davos, because it was a very dramatic point when Trump, almost casually speaking, this giant head speaking from the screen among this audience of thousands, said, I'd like Saudi Arabia to drive down the oil price and it could end the war in a day. As you said, putting pressure on allies to do this. What should we make of that?
Well, I mean, that's probably the most interesting thing he raised, because the declining price of oil would hit Putin where it hurts and might actually be a substantive tool to use against them. And so, we'll have to see how successful he is in that. He's asking Mohammed bin Salman for a lot of things, including $1 trillion of direct investment in the United States.
Which 600 billion had been offered,
and he said, "Why not top it up?
Make it $1 trillion, a beautiful number." Yeah.
Exactly. To just top that up.
I give Steve Schwartzman, the big financier, head of Blackstone, full marks for saying from the panel at that point, "I'm sure the Crown Prince is delighted you made that speech."
Right.
Mr.
Indeed.
President.
Indeed. So, I mean, we're now going to enter a very interesting phase where all of the posturing and campaign rhetoric is going to meet the reality of countries that have complex agendas. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, the Saudis clearly want to have a good relationship with the U.S. and with Trump, but Trump wants the Saudis to do several different things. In addition to driving down the price of oil, he also wants the Saudis to become a part of the Abraham Accords and recognize Israel over time. Perhaps that's an even bigger goal than the short-term goal of oil prices. So there's a lot of complexities here that we'll have to see play out.
Orysia, you were in Davos with me, and you were watching Zelenskyy as he also signalled what seemed to a lot of people like a change in position. He didn't exactly say a deal or on for a deal, but he certainly talked about the security guarantees that Ukraine would want. And this sounded very much like a change of position, as well as, I thought, a remarkable pitch to Europe saying, come on, Europe, get your act together. You're great. We want to join you, but get it together. How much of a change of position is this, in your view?
Well, clearly, Ukraine is exhausted by the war. It's been now lasting for 3 years. It's taking heavy toll on its people. But at the same time, when I travel to Ukraine and talk to Ukrainians, I don't sense the total mood of resignation or taking any deal at any cost, because Ukraine has already paid too high of a price, and because, to be honest, they understand the origin of this war is not in Kyiv, it's in the Kremlin, and that regime still stays in power, so the threat remains. Zelenskyy is playing it smartly. He actually in Davos was appealing to Europe to take its share of responsibility. It's not that America is not willing to help. He says, Europeans, what are you putting on the table for your own security? This war is in Europe. It's quite striking already in our conversation how also far-reaching global effects it has. We already talked about North Korea, talked about Saudi Arabia and all these countries that could actually, depending on the action they take, shift it one way or the other. But Zelenskyy is clear. He will try to cooperate with Trump. He doesn't want to upset Trump because a lot hinges on American military assistance to Ukraine. And that military assistance actually is delivering quite good results. Francis talked about battlefield experience. Last year, Russia only was able to conquer 4,000 square kilometers of Ukraine, which is 600,000 square kilometers. And for that type of gains, Ukraine is not ready to sacrifice its sovereignty. And this is what Zelenskyy says. We're not going to just agree to anything either Trump or Putin wants.
Francis, where is Putin in this?
Well, I think that Putin is watching very closely what he can get away with. And I think that this is why the onus has to be on the West to put up a robust response, and hence why it is such a tragedy that Europe has not been able, as I said earlier on, to form its own clear articulation of what it wants to see happen in Ukraine. And that's a tragedy that's been unfolding throughout the duration of the war. My own view on Putin is that he operates in the space that's afforded to him. And we have afforded him, the West, a great degree of space over the duration of the war. It's he who has escalated it in terms of the weapons that have been used, the threats that have been made. And as we enter this next phase, I think that still remains true. If he thinks that he can strike some kind of deal that would mean him taking vast swathes of the east of Ukraine, then he will continue to escalate this war in terms of the resources that he throws in, the threats that he makes, to try and get to that point. Bear in mind, he has never abandoned his maximalist aims for Ukraine. Only yesterday, he was talking about the need for Ukrainian sovereignty to effectively be dissipated completely. That President Zelenskyy must not be part of any talks, and that Kyiv essentially requires a new government which is more sympathetic to the Russian perspective. For him, the key to this is not just territorial, given that he still feels he's in a strong position. He still wants Ukrainian sovereignty on the table. And the question is the West willing to ultimately say to Ukraine, we're not willing to give you the guarantees, and we also think, that you're on your own on this one, apart from giving you enough military support to deciding when enough is enough for you. But I think that he really is, at this moment, still thinking, I can get more from this if I grind it out than if I go to the talks now. And I'm not convinced that these talks that are upcoming will be meaningful, because I think the gap between the two sides is still vast.
Just tell us a tiny bit about what these talks are in practice.
Well, I think we don't yet know, and that's actually
we don't have a date, and we don't know who will be talking.
No date, no
these
clarity.
Are notional talks.
President Zelenskyy has said that it should be up to Europe to put on the table what it wants these talks to look like. I think most realists believe that the first stage is the conversations that are going to take place between Trump and Putin to see if there is any understanding about where there might be some common ground that can be found. But of course, there should be major concerns again from a European and Ukrainian perspective as to that, because both Trump and Putin come at this from wanting to have some kind of deal, presumably, which benefits both sides. So I think ultimately we have no real clear pathway to negotiations. And just if I may say one more thing, I completely agree with what Orysia was saying about the Ukrainian position. I was in Kharkiv back at the end of November, which is the frontline city, and bombs going off every 3 hours, and still there, they do not see a pathway to peace. They want peace. Everyone wants peace. Everybody wants an end to the war, but they do not see a pathway in which negotiations can be meaningful and Russia can be and should never to invade again. And so they keep fighting, and they are happy to keep fighting until they can see that pathway.
So let's take that. I hear you. I really hear you, what you're saying. Let's take that and that reminder of not just realism, but of what Ukrainians are feeling now. But just try to talk a bit about what a deal could look like, what a good deal might be.
From Ukraine's point of view, it would be a deal where they, hold on and retake as much of the territory that they've lost as they can, if not all of it. And then some security guarantee so that they don't have to worry that a year from now the Russians roll across the border again. So that's the deal that they want, one that really gives them their full sovereignty and territory back. From Putin's point of view, obviously, it's I get to keep everything that I've taken so far, and I get to make sure that Ukraine never joins NATO. It's also maybe I get guarantee of a new government that's much more Russia friendly. So at the moment, people's concept of what a good deal is are poles apart.
Orysia, if Ukraine can't get all this territory back, or it just isn't realistic, it's making no advance or whatever, is there a deal that would enable Ukraine to thrive, to get its people back, to begin to live again without the fear that Russia's going to do with this again? What would that look like?
I think Bronwen, people in Ukraine and Zelenskyy as the leader of Ukraine does believe that the outcome of this war will have a huge impact on the world order. The world we and our children will be living tomorrow. That is why Ukrainians, I almost sometimes think, like the last romantics of the global world order. They're saying, look, we can somehow survive, and Ukraine is resisting now for 3 years. It didn't collapse. The economy didn't collapse. The banking didn't collapse. Railways are running. But we want to make sure that other countries like ours can have sovereignty. And this is what the fight is about. That is why Russia has nothing to say about Ukraine's membership in NATO. It's up for negotiations between Ukraine and its allies. If allies are not ready now, if their threat perception is that it will jeopardize collective security, then it's a fair point. But it should not be up for negotiations with Putin. The same with regards to European Union or any other pathway that Ukraine chooses to choose. Now, on territory, I think it's a principal question that any annexations are not recognized. No annexation should not be recognized.
This is the point I made in my annual lecture.
That is a very
even
good
if Ukraine
point.
has to acknowledge that Russia is controlling the territory,
Anybody can acknowledge it.
it would be unfortunate for all the reasons about principles of sovereignty that you've said. It would be really unfortunate if Donald Trump put pressure on Ukraine to say, legitimize this, agree that Russia has got this territory.
Yeah, well, then Trump will become like a de facto endorser of the bully, which I'm not sure he wants to be. So another thing in that kind of element of Ukraine's thriving and developing, rebuilding, is security guarantees. And we do know that there are already conversations about the multinational force and observers mission. They've started bilaterally between Ukraine, France, multilaterally at the NATO level. There are countries that had a meeting hosted by the NATO Secretary General Rutte in Brussels that included UK, Poland, France, Germany, to discuss what kind of force, what type of force and when could be deployed in Ukraine day one, let's say if there is a ceasefire, and these numbers are big. We are talking between 50 and 100,000 troops because, as I said, Ukraine is a big country, the front line is big. And that is a big question because only if there is this solid defense treaty almost, not just the security, but defense compact for Ukraine, investors can come, people can return, Ukrainian economy can thrive.
You've described for us the romance, which can be a very difficult thing in war, but the principles of sovereignty, which is why Europe has taken this so seriously. But you've also described the realism, and begun to sketch out what I think people are thinking may evolve is Ukraine acknowledging it can't get back this territory. So what would a security guarantee look like?
I think just on this point about security guarantees and troops on the ground, we need to be a little bit careful that we don't end up in that situation and then come to regret it later. And what I mean by that
and who is we in that?
I would say Britain, I would say France, I would say Germany, I would say those powers who would actually be the ones who pragmatically would put troops on the ground.
Interesting. Sorry, I'm just going to stop you. If you could just unpack that a bit, because you've said it almost matter-of-factly, and yet these are points of huge debate in these countries. It is not taken for granted in Britain at all.
My understanding from conversations taking in the British government is that if there were a coalition of the willing, that they would be up for doing it. And yet, I would say that the reality is that there is uncertainty, and it will all depend on whether the Americans are willing to also provide some kind of protective arc over this as well. I think Europe is very concerned about the idea that it alone would be the sole defender of the Ukrainians should the worst happen. But the reason I throw in this scepticism here about whether this could be articulated as any kind of victory or recipe for lasting peace is the whole of the British Army, if it was mobilised and required to defend Ukraine, could only defend 10% of the border if indeed there were a land invasion.
And I'm glad you brought up that figure. We're beginning to hear things coming out of the Defence Review led by George Robertson that where Britain has ammunition only for 2.5 days.
Indeed. And so these calculations need to be very seriously considered. And just on the point about investment and security guarantees, I often heard, and I remember I first heard this put to me in Washington in 2023 by somebody who's now involved, I think, in the transition team. They said, South Korea model would be a huge success for Ukraine.
Just explain what you mean by that.
Well, basically a frozen conflict with
the border, not a peace.
Exactly. No peace, contested territory, but Western investment, Western security that gives South Korea or Ukraine a bright future. But I would just say, if that is your definition of victory, the idea that Europe remains in a frozen conflict with a power that is becoming more and more aggressive through hybrid warfare, threatening nuclear annihilation, if that's your articulation of victory, then what a shift you've made in the last 3 years. And I think we need to be very, very cautious if that's the objective that we're going for.
I think that's the first time the word victory has been used on this podcast, because I'm conscious how much the debate has moved in 3 years. People are really just talking about some kind of deal that might shut this down. Mark, what do you make of this picture? The US demanding that Europe contribute to security guarantees, but trying really to freeze the conflict there.
Well, I mean, I actually wanted to get back to an earlier point about the world order. I mean, I think one of the sort of slightly worrisome undertones of this whole concept, of that whole discussion, is that Donald Trump has made it clear he's not a defender of the world order, and he's a disruptor of the world order. So it's interesting to think of a negotiation that may be unfolding at the same time that he's attempting to seize the Panama Canal and convince or bully the Danes into turning over Greenland. So, this whole notion of how Ukraine would be, a sort of a compromise settlement in Ukraine would be so damaging to the idea of the world order. Well, Trump is going to threaten the world order in a number of different ways. And so it's hard for me to sort of think that we can count on the United States to play that role, since they may well be jeopardizing it in other parts of the world. But in terms of a frozen conflict, I think Trump will be extremely wary about any kind of arc of security that they throw over a peacekeeping force, probably on the grounds that he'll feel that it inexorably will lead to a demand for boots on the ground as opposed to just some sort of broader security, and he won't want to do that. And the
no boots, no American
boots, period, but not even any hint that there could be in the future. And then the other thing that he's going to have to manage politically himself is there is a strong contingent of the MAGA movement that wants to cut and run and has wanted to cut and run and make a dirty deal with Putin from the very beginning. And those people are still vocal. They're not actually the people that are in his top group of advisors. Those people tend to be a little more traditionalist about this. If you look at Marco Rubio and statements he made at the beginning of this conflict, much more traditional and Republican.
He's the incoming Secretary of State.
The incoming Secretary of State, the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, Keith Kellogg, who I mentioned earlier. These guys bring probably a more traditional Republican foreign policy view to this conflict. But at the same time, Trump has a noisy contingent led by people like Steve Bannon, a former senior strategy advisor to the president, who's now a kind of an unofficial leader of the MAGA crowd. And those people want a deal in which the U.S. would cut and run from Ukraine. And Trump's going to be weighing those forces domestically as he goes into this negotiation.
So you've taken us, as has Orysia, right to this central point of what is the Ukraine conflict going to represent for the West. Is it just handing over the Donbass to Russia, perhaps temporarily, or is it really handing over the principles of defending sovereignty and saying you can't invade another country by force, which go right to the UN Charter itself, 1945? Francis, looking at Trump, he's come in, all these extraordinary statements that seemed like jokes at the first, then weren't, about Greenland, about the Panama Canal. Has this taken America completely out of the principle of defending order in the world?
I think under Donald Trump, it is important to fundamentally underscore his transactional approach to politics, and the fact that whilst there is perhaps an ideology there, fundamentally this is a man who wants to make deals that make him look good. He doesn't back losers, and I think that is, if you're looking for optimism from the Ukrainian perspective, you would say that the last thing that he wants, and I've heard this as well from people who are very much connected with what's going on in the defence portion of Trump's team, he's terrified of another Afghanistan withdrawal type disaster for that the Biden administration had. And thereby, if you're looking for optimism, you would say, well, he's acknowledged publicly in the statement that Mark alluded to that the Russian economy is incredibly fragile, which it is, 20% inflation on certain key goods. There are huge question marks about the long-term durability of the Russian ability to wage this war. And so in that sense, you would say he's not going to back Putin ultimately because he knows that he can squeeze him very hard, and thereby there is an opportunity for a victory, and he would take that. On the broader question of the American position globally, I think that all bets are off. I think that it is very important, and this is why it was so disappointing to see the failure of Europe to form some kind of coherent position that needed to be taken seriously, because of the reliance on the United States means that basically we're here with our begging bowl. Let's be blunt about this in many respects. And I think, though, if we're looking at this from the American perspective, I think there does need to be more caution from President Trump and indeed those around him. What makes America unique as a superpower is not just its strength, but its allies. And I think that what we've seen with this dispute around Greenland and certain other issues around Ukraine is that people are, for the first time in a very, very long time, are seriously questioning the American position on fundamentals. And that is not necessarily a good thing for the United States' prosperity in the long term. Because in a world where you've got China, you've got Russia, you've got other entities that claim to have some kind of great power status. I would question that with regard to Russia, by the way, but nonetheless, there are many who still see it in that way. What makes America unique is not just its power. China is very powerful, but it's not just its power. It's the alliances that it has formed based on fundamental principles that have been built and extended by blood over basically a century. And so, if America is willing to just throw that away, I don't necessarily see that being for its own benefit, let alone the world's.
Orysia, can Europe step into this gap and articulate these principles, even rise up and defend them?
Well, I think Europe is already stepping up in a way. Remember last year when the US aid to military assistance to Ukraine was completely on hold? For half a year, actually, Ukrainian front lines didn't collapse partially because Germany stepped in, because Czech had an initiative for artillery shells that was global, that include purchasing that out of South Korea. So I think that with the new position of the Commissioner for Defense in Brussels, and Ursula von der Leyen is clearly making security front and central for European Union. They are trying to put together $500 billion fund to support defense industry in European Union, which will be a kind of a collective borrowing facility similar to they've done through COVID times in order to invest. And I think this is the kind of number that may also get Trump interested, right? Or maybe she should make it $1 trillion following that remark in Davos. But it's a significant amount. And here again, UK comes into play. Will UK step up? Starmer was in Kiev recently signing 100-year partnership with Ukraine. From the messaging point, that sounds terrific, but what will be the content of it? And will UK actually develop bilateral defense and cooperation agreements with Ukraine and fix its relations with European Union, which is so key to have Europe one and united on front against Russia?
As we bring this to a close, I have to say I keep coming back to this image at the end of Davos. The huge head of Donald Trump projected on the screen above everyone. And someone said to me, is this a Wizard of Oz moment? And we've got to see whether there's really anything behind the screen. But others were frankly envious of the executive power of the American president, the strength of the American economy. We're going to have to see which one wins out. We've got to wrap it up for this week. Thank you so much to my guests, Mark Landler, Francis Dearnley, Orysia Lutsevych. You can find links to all their social media and those for Chatham House in the show notes, so do get in touch. And we've got lots of terrific events coming up, including one with Russia, who you've just been listening to, on the role of the Orthodox churches in Russia and Ukraine during the war. Do listen to that. Next week, we're also joined by Dr. Comfort Ero from the International Crisis Group to discuss the ICG's annual report on 10 conflicts to watch in 2025. They are not running out of conflicts, I think. That report has some way to go. Details for those events and many more at chathamhouse.org. For now, that's it from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next time.